In this lesson, we're going to study the demand for labor and look at what causes shifts in the demand for labor by firms. So we're going to begin our demand for labor with a little bit of review. So the labor force is the population over the age of 16 that is working or trying to get a job. We notice, of course, that in 2010, that was about 50% of the population. But when we break that down into the labor force participation rate, the number is actually about 62 to 64% annually of the working age U.S. population. So we know that basically about 62 to 64% of the people who could be working are either working or trying to find a job. Annually, about 90 to 95% of the labor force will be employed. That number fluctuates on a month-to-month basis. And that there exists a natural rate of unemployment because minimum wages create a price floor in the market. As minimum wages increase, the natural rate of unemployment will increase. And the primary reason there is because as minimum wages increase, of course, it creates an incentive for more people to seek employment. So we end up with an increased minimum wage, creating an increase in the surplus of labor because of the incentives. So the demand for labor decreases as the minimum wage rises. So we see, of course, this opposing force working within the market that as wages rise, the demand for labor decreases while the supply of labor will increase. So minimum wages do not affect skilled labor markets though, and that's because the increased education and skill requirements reduce the supply of labor and make the demand of labor more inelastic. So it increases the value of that labor. Okay, so when this happens, we see supply shifting to the left, which is what we'll talk about later, and it decreases the price elasticity of demand. So it becomes more, instead of elastic, it becomes more inelastic. And so the combination of the two shifts the equilibrium in skilled labor markets up and to the left, and as a result, wages are higher than minimum wage. So those are some basic things we've looked at so far. So what we're going to do now is really get into looking at what drives the demand and how many workers do they hire when you're looking at these firms. Okay, so the demand for labor is what we call a derived demand. So like financial capital, labor is a resource supplied to firms by households, and the demand for the factors of production is a derived demand. So all factors of production face a derived demand. Now what that means, and this is especially noticeable in the labor market, it means that the firm's demand for a factor of production is derived from its decision to supply a good or service in another market. In other words, if we decide that we're going to supply more computers, then we need to hire people to help produce those computers. So the decision that you make to supply a good or service in one market affects the decisions you make in terms of what resources you are buying and how much. In particular, labor, because that's one of the variable costs that firms face. So if you decide to increase production of a good, then that means you're going to have to look at the possibility of hiring more labor. If you decide to decrease production of a good, then you would obviously look at the possibility of decreasing the amount of labor in which you employ. So just a simple example here, if we take the demand for office furniture increases. So our result here is going to be, we must increase the supply of inputs. And we're going to hire more employees. That's a part of this factor. So basically, we need to get the materials that we need to produce the office furniture, but we're also going to have to hire more employees to help build the furniture. And why are we doing that? Because the demand for office furniture in and of itself increased. So the firm increases its supply of office furniture. Well, in order to increase its supply of office furniture, they have to have those two inputs. And that's what happens is if you have the demand for one good in the market, then you're going to increase your demand for the products to produce those goods. So in order for you to supply more of those goods, you got to hire the employees, you've got to buy the resources. So that's kind of how this is going to work out. So firms hire the quantities of the factors of production that maximize profit. Remember, the goal of the firm at all times is to maximize their profits. So in order to do so, they're going to hire the quantities they need to do so, but they're not going to hire any more than that. So they're always going to hire the exact amount that helps to maximize their profit. So let's break this down a little bit, make it even easier to understand and kind of give you an idea of what's taking place. So firms don't value the labor itself, rather they value the labor's ability to produce. In other words, firms don't value you as an employee, they value what you bring to the table. What you're able to do is the actual value here. There's tons of people. It's what matters is what those people can do with the skill set they have. So the more the labor can produce and the higher the price of the product, the more valuable the labor is. In other words, workers who produce things that aren't of value aren't very valuable to the company itself. They're easily replaceable. But if you have a skill set that allows you to produce something that is difficult to produce and it has a high price in the market, you automatically become a very valuable source, and thus you're going to be paid more. So if you can produce 50 cheeseburgers an hour, but the price of cheeseburgers is only $1, you're not very valuable to the firm. In fact, you're easily replaceable by a robot. But if that cheeseburger costs $100, then your value increases. And more than likely, the more you can produce, you're going to be able to. So the demand for labor is a derived demand, in which value is based on the demand for the product the resource produces. And that's a key point to remember, is that the value of the product you produce ultimately is going to determine the demand for the labor that can produce it. So if something has a very high value, then that labor that can produce that is all the more valuable to that company, and therefore they're willing to pay more. They're demanding more of that labor source. And that's productivity. So the more productive a resource, the more a firm is willing to pay for it. And this helps to explain why professional athletes make so much money. This is an easy one to look at, because if you look at professional athletes, and we'll take baseball for example, since not all baseball players are productive, the ones who are become very valuable to the team they play for, and so therefore they make more money. So you can see why some individuals make contracts that literally look like $20 to $25 million a year. And it's because those are the individuals that are productive within the organization. And the more productive they are, the more valuable they become to the team they play for. And what all does a team get from that player besides just production on the field? Think about the jersey sales, ticket sales, season ticket sales, all of the different intangible objects and tangible objects that come from the value of that player besides just their production on the field. If you've got all of your players on the field and 3 of them just are average regular players, but then you've got 2 that are superstars, well, you know who's getting the majority of the money, and it's because of the value they bring to the program itself. So we're going to look at this term. It's the value of the marginal product. So how much of a factor does a firm buy? That's a really important question, because one of the things about profit maximization is that we want to be efficient within the production process. We don't want to waste. And so if we buy too much of a resource, we're wasting. If we don't buy enough, we're still wasting, because now we're short on what we could be selling. So it's a very important thing for firms to understand just how much of a factor they're actually going to be purchasing. And so the answer is the firm's value of marginal product. That's going to determine how much of a factor they buy. So value of marginal product is the value to a firm of hiring 1 more unit of a factor of production. So how valuable is it to go from, say, 3 to 4 workers, 4 to 5, 5 to 6? You got to remember diminishing marginal returns. One of the things we said was that as we hired more workers, the less productive they became. So one of the things about that is there's an ideal number of employees in which we could employ. We could have 2 less, or we could have too many. And if we have too many, we could actually see our production decline based on what we've studied so far with our diminishing marginal returns. So this equals the price of a unit of output multiplied by the marginal product of the factor of production. And we'll look at the numbers and look at the graphs to make more sense out of that. But it equals the price of a unit of output. So what can they put out multiplied by the marginal product of the factor of production. So suppose there's a firm that's producing tires. To determine how many people to hire, the firm must determine how the size of its workforce affects the amount of tires produced. And this is what we're talking about. So the firm must consider how the number of laborers affects the quantity of tires it can produce and sell. Remember what we talked about, having too many workers can be a negative. So when we look at this graph here, we can get the idea. So the price of 1 tire is $70. So the first 2 columns show the firm's ability to produce. Notice here we have the number of workers that increases, and then we have their output. So what we see here is this marginal product of labor, the tires per week. So we're noticing here that with 1 employee, we can produce 50 tires per week. When we increase, then we get 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. So as we increase workers, we see a decrease in the number of tires those workers are able to produce. So 5 workers, we only see 10 extra tires produced. Whereas when we went from 1 to 2, we saw 40. So 2 workers could produce 90 tires in a week. But then when we go to the 5th worker, we're only seeing an extra 10 tires. Now, when we take that number and we multiply, see here the value of the marginal product of labor, which is $70. So 70 times 50, and then we go down the line, we see the value of the marginal product of labor. So we take that number, multiply it, and this is what we get. So here's the value of increasing by 1 employee. So going from employee 4 to employee 5, you notice we lose $700. Whereas going from employee 3 to employee 4, we gain $700. So that's what we're looking at. That's the value of this marginal product of labor. So if you're looking at this, would you hire 5 employees? The answer to that is no. You wouldn't go past 4, because if you go past 4, you begin to lose money. So we can take this production function and we can actually graph this out. So the production function is the relationship between the quantity of inputs used to make a good and the quantity of output. So the quantity of inputs, it's our quantity of labors, and the quantity of output is the quantity of tires per week. So that's what we're going to look at, this relationship. So we can actually graph this. So in this example, all other factors are constant. The only thing we're looking at is labor. We're ignoring every other factor of production at the moment. So we look at this first point. So with 1 worker, 50. 2 workers, we see it goes to 90. 3 workers, we'll see it jumps to 120. 4 workers, we go to 140. And so as the number of laborers increases, the property of diminishing marginal product is seen. So you'll notice when we get to the 5th one, it starts to level out. We see it starting to curve. So now we look at this line. And so what we notice, of course, is that we see the diminishing marginal product. We see it start to diminish as we add more and more workers. So this is the production function. Now, as new laborers are hired, each additional worker contributes less to the production of tires. So we can just kind of draw a line down here and go to this point. So at this point, we're already starting to see diminishing margining returns. Now, if we go to the other side of this, notice that we can actually start to get into the negative. And so what we're really saying here is if we hire too many employees, those employees are actually going to cause us to lose money, because we're going to pay more for the factors of production than we're actually making in terms of our total revenue. So total cost could increase above total revenue if we hire too many employees. So it's important to understand this production function from the standpoint of what is the ideal place for us to stop hiring workers. Okay, so let's break this down and look at it. So the firm's goal is profit maximization. We know that. And in order to maximize profits, the firm must consider how much profit each worker brings in. And that's really the big question. If we hire too many workers, they'll quit bringing in profit. So we need to know what number we want. So the value of marginal product is the value to a firm of hiring 1 more unit of a factor of production. What is the value of hiring another worker? So this is simply VMP is equal to P times MP. So this is price and marginal product. So like we did earlier, we can look at it here and graph it. So you'll notice when we look at this graph, we see the value of the marginal product of labor. And essentially what we're saying is we're taking that output there, that marginal product, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, and we're multiplying that times the price, which is 70. So you'll notice as we work in adding another employee, the value of the marginal product goes down. So as we hire employees, the value of each new employee goes down a certain amount. So our graph shows that the value of marginal product is downward sloping because of the property of diminishing marginal returns. So what this tells us is that whenever a firm hires a new employee, the value of hiring that new employee goes down. In other words, what they're bringing to the table is reduced for each new employee. So how do we know where to stop and where to maximize profits at? So profit maximization for the firm occurs when the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage. So pretty simple. All we need to know is the wage. Once we know the wage, then where those two lines intersect, that's the point at which we stop, in which we no longer hire more employees. So when we look at our graph here and we see our numbers, notice the wage is $13.75 per week. So that's what we're paying. So when $13.75 intersects with our value of the marginal product of labor, which is the graph we just looked at, that's where we're going to stop. So in the table, the wage per week for laborers is $13.75. We see that at a wage rate of $13.75 a week, the number of laborers the firm will hire is 4. Now I can tell that it's 4 because of one simple reason. If you look at the very last column, you'll notice that the last number there, when they hire 5 workers, you see what happens? It equals minus $675. So basically, the value of the marginal product of labor minus the wage equals marginal product. When that number is negative, that's when you stop. You don't hire more than that. So if they hired 1 additional worker, the firm would lose profit. So we stop at the blue line because we're taking the value of marginal product, 3,500, 2,800, 2,100, 1,400, and we're subtracting 1375 from it. That gives us marginal product. When marginal product is in the negative, we can't hire that worker. So in this firm, they will hire 4 workers and no more, because if they hire the 5th worker, they begin to lose money. So you can see how this works. So to maximize profits, we're going to hire 4 workers, and we can look at the graph on this. So when we look at the graph here and we pull this up, as we go down, as we hire our workers, this is our value of the marginal product. Now, no, this is also the demand for labor. So this shows us the demand curve. So this is the value of the marginal product of labor. It also equals the demand curve. Now, when we look at this, we notice those two are the same. And now here's why. It's because the labor demand curve tells us the quantity of labor that a firm demands at any given wage. So as we work across and look at wages, what we can see is that as wages increase, we'll hire less workers. So profit maximization for the firm occurs when the value of the marginal product of labor equals a wage. So let's put the wage in there. We can see right here, here's our wage. So you'll notice if wages increase to 2,100, then we're only going to hire 3 workers. So as wages increase, we hire less workers. That's the law of demand. As price increases, quantity demanded goes down. So if the wage were to drop to $6.75, then we would hire the 5th worker. But because the wage is $13.75, then we hire the 4th worker, and that's it. We don't go any farther. So that wage rate at $13.75 per week shows us exactly how many employees each firm would hire. So every firm can calculate the exact number of employees they intend to hire. So if the firm hired a 5th worker, they would lose money, and we know that because marginal product is a negative $6.75. So our last question we want to look at within the demand is what causes shifts? What causes demand to move to the left and right in the labor market? So the first one here, the first determinant is the demand for the final product. So when the price of the firm's output increases, the demand for labor increases, and the labor demand curve shifts to the right. So if the price of the good that we produce increases, meaning you know how a supply curve works. So if the price increases, we will want to supply more of a good because we have a greater incentive for profit. So if the supply of, let's say when we were looking at it earlier when we said office furniture, if the supply of office furniture, if the price of office furniture increased, we would increase the supply of it. In order to increase the supply, we'd have to hire more labor. So when the price of the firm's output increases, the demand for labor increases, and the labor curve shifts to the right. So we'll take an example here, an easy one with carpenters. So for example, if the demand for housing increases, we will obviously build more houses. In order to do that, we have to hire more carpenters. So if the demand for housing increases, as will the demand for carpenters. causing a shift in demand curve to the right. And that's an easy one to understand. If the price of the product we produce goes up, so will the demand for the labor that produces that good. There's also a technological change, so this is factor number 2. And this is kind of tricky though. So I'll give you an example. If technology allows to be more productive, that's what technology allows. But it could also make a worker obsolete. So if new technology is developed that can produce tires, remember our last example, using just a machine, then the firm might install the machine and fire its workforce. So they would get rid of the 4 employees and go to a machine instead. The firms that manufacture and service those machines would see an increase in demand for labor though. So the labor that produces the tires would be fired. In other words, they would see a demand that would shift to the left because it would decrease. However, the firm that manufactures the machinery and services the machinery would see an increase in demand and they would shift to the right. So technology has a double factor here in the fact that it reduces the demand for one type of worker and increases the demand for another. So you can look at it from the stance of in grocery stores today, they have all of these self-checkout machines. Well, by creating self-checkout machines, we reduce the demand for people to do checking out. But we increase the demand for people who can produce the machinery and also service the machinery. So robots don't need wages or healthcare or breaks or vacations. So it becomes very much an efficiency standpoint. And this is one of the primary reasons there's not as many manufacturing jobs in the United States anymore. It's because we have created technology which eliminates a large portion of the workforce that does those jobs. And so what happens, of course, is those individuals have to find new types of jobs. And one of the jobs, of course, that's opening up is the individuals who are able to actually manufacture those machines and also to maintain those machines. So our third determinant is the price of other resources. So what would happen to carpenters if the price of pre-made walls went down? And this is an interesting question. So some resources are substitutes in production, and these are called resource substitutes. If I can buy pre-made walls, then I don't need as many carpenters because one aspect of the job is already done. So what would happen to carpenters if the price of pre-made walls went down? Well, the answer is thus the demand for carpenters would fall. So the demand for carpenters would shift to the left because we don't need as many. Now the people who could produce the pre-made walls though, they would see an increase in demand. So on the other hand, there's also resource complements. If the price of lumber went down, would that encourage people to employ more carpenters? And it's an interesting question. If the price of lumber went down, would it be cheaper for us to build houses? And the answer to that question is yes. So because the price of lumber went down, we can build more houses. Therefore, we must employ more carpenters. So since lumber is cheaper, you can buy more wood, and thus you would need more carpenters to build houses. So that's how these 3 determinants work. Now, when we graph them, we look at shifts in the demand curve. We'll take our 3 examples. So when the price of the firm's output increases, the demand for labor increases. The labor curve shifts to the right. Firms that have the ability to manufacture and service machinery would see an increase in the demand for labor if robots were installed in a factory, shift to the right. If the price of rubber went down, the firm could employ more workers and the demand for labor would shift to the right. So when we look at it, here's our wage rate, $13.75 per week. Here's our demand curve. So here's our current equilibrium. So we're going to hire 4 workers at a wage rate of $13.75. If one of these things were to occur over here on the left, if any one of these factors were to occur, what we would see is we would see an increase in the demand curve. So it shifts to the right. So instead of hiring 4 workers, now we're looking at hiring 6 workers. And so that's how that works. So in our next lesson, we'll look at the supply of labor.